We've been exploring the state questions. We will continue to do that over the next couple of weeks. Today we're going to look at state question 780, 781. I won't dive into it. We have them up on a slide, and Trent England from the Trent England Show and OCPA is going to talk to us about them. Please welcome Trent England.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Good to see Charlie. Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me here. And this is a topic I love to talk about because I never thought when I got into public policy, when I got into law, I thought, the one area I never want to work on is criminal law. And criminal policy, and I wound up at the Heritage Foundation, and I wound up working for Ronald Reagan's former Attorney General Ed Meese, and nobody I think has ever accused Ed Meese of being soft on crime. He led the efforts at the federal level against things like child pornography and strengthening all sort of the federal law enforcement areas of federal law enforcement. But he is, in fact, one of the leaders, and he's the person who I first worked with on criminal justice reform, and came to see this as an issue that is very important, partly for a very political, pragmatic reason. And that is that most Americans don't trust Michael Dukakis or whomever else on the political left with our criminal justice system, because most Americans recognize that those folks have some ideas about crime that confound our human experience, and certainly go against a Christian idea of morality and human nature. And so most Americans don't trust the left on crime, and I think that's a good thing. But it also means that if you are a conservative, if you're a libertarian, if you find yourself generally somewhere on the political right, we are the only ones who can fix this system. And I really came to believe that is true, and it's been fascinating to work in some right-left coalitions. I'm going to leave lots of time for questions. Somebody the other day was accusing me of doing George Soros's bidding. You can ask me whatever questions you want at the end. I haven't got my call from George Soros yet, but who knows, right? I do want to put a plug in right here at the beginning on all the ballot measures. I didn't have enough of these. In fact, this is my only copy of this because these have been so popular. But it's all on the website ocpathink.org. Simple descriptions of the ballot measures and what they do. And this is not a voter guide. This is just a tool if somebody is looking for information about just what do these do? What do they mean? The basics of them. It's a good starting point for talking with people about the ballot measures. But I'm going to talk particularly about State Question 780, State Question 781. What do they do? What do these measures do? The first thing I want to point out, because this is different from the other 5 state questions on our November ballots, these are statutory. They're not constitutional. That to me is very, very important. Because, frankly, I say this maybe I shouldn't say this, but I don't think I'd support these measures if they were constitutional, right? I think it's very important when you're making changes to the criminal law and criminal punishment that you maintain the ability for the legislature to come back and make adjustments to these things over time, right? And it's frustrating to me. It's probably frustrating to many of you. We have this overlong state constitution that is probably going to get even longer with the state questions on the ballot this November. It's not a good way to make public policy, and it does not increase regard for our state constitution. And I think both of those things are problematic. These are statutory, right? And so, I have heard all kinds of frightening scenarios about what might happen in this little area or that little area or over here. And the reality is, 780, 781, if it turns out that the threshold for the difference between simple possession of meth, as a DA was lecturing me on the other day. Well, simple possession, that's a lot of meth. Well, the legislature can come back and change where that threshold is, right? This doesn't bind them at all. All State Question 780 does is take a group of nonviolent crimes and that are currently felony crimes and reclassify those crimes as misdemeanor crimes. And what that means, the definition today, and I'm actually going to go back and talk a little about the history of all this, because I think the history of justice reform is fascinating. You're going to be surprised who some of the first criminal justice reformers in our country were. But The definition today of a felony is a crime that's punishable by 1 year or more in state prison. A misdemeanor crime, still a crime, but it's punishable by up to 1 year incarceration and typically that's served in the county jail. Right? Still a crime. The question is, so I had somebody flipping out on Facebook this morning, you're decriminalizing drugs. Well, if you think that's a good idea, if you don't think that's a good idea, that has not, it's not what this does. It changes, so what are the nonviolent crimes? Simple possession of a controlled substance, right? So this is the crime that is targeted at people who are possessing drugs, not to sell them, they're not making them, they're not trafficking them, they're not in the drug business, right? Those are other crimes, those would still be felonies. This is the crime of simple possession. Someone is caught with drugs. It is a relatively small amount. Again, maybe those amounts should be changed. I don't, willing to consider that, right? But for what we as a state consider simple possession of a controlled substance for a person's own use, we would say that no longer should be a felony punishable by up to 15 years in state prison. Instead, it should be a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in county jail. It also changes the threshold for property crimes, and this is something that goes up over time. In Oklahoma, it used to be $50, right? So if somebody got mad and punched the side view mirror on my car and broke it off, that would have been a felony because that even though my car's kind of old, right? That would be several $100s worth of damage, right? So Oklahoma in the past raised that threshold from 50 up to 500, and now this would raise it from 500 up to 1,000. 1,000 is the federal threshold for a felony. Texas actually recently raised their felony threshold up to $2,500, it's just. I mean, it's sort of inflation, right? I don't have to lecture anybody here on the problems of inflation, but the reality is it makes sense to raise that threshold over time. What's the practical difference? Right, so these are the things that State Question 780 would do. What's the practical difference? The idea, I can tell you because I was involved with the people who drafted these measures. The idea is that with nonviolent criminals, particularly people who have a drug addiction. Department of Corrections says about half the people in our state prisons have mental health problems, diagnosed mental health problems. The idea is it's not a good idea to take low-level offenders and put them in state prisons, especially not for a long time, right? That oftentimes we'll take people who have a drug addiction, have a mental health problem, and direct them not away from crime, but direct them to more serious crimes, mix them with a population of people who actually are antisocial and committing violent crimes, and we just don't think that's a good idea. I'll tell you, just as a Christian, I think the idea that somebody who is addicted to drugs, any drug, opiates, the prescription stuff. What's that? That's another debate. But for a person who has a drug addiction, right? I think the idea that our state law says that person is guilty of a felony and punishable by up to 15 years in state prison, I actually have a moral problem with that. As a conservative, I have a problem with the answer that I usually get from prosecutors when I bring this up. They say, well, we would never we would never put anybody in prison for that long. Right? In fact, they say, typically, if we really think this person needs help, then we're going to get him help and we're not going to put him in prison at all. And, it's only the bad people. Right? It's only the really bad people that we lock them up for 15 years, but we in our infinite wisdom direct all these other people. And frankly, I think most DAs really do want to help people, right? I think most of the DAs I've come in contact with, they really do want to help people. But as a conservative, I have a big problem with shifting that much power to the executive branch. Right? I understand that makes the job easier for a prosecutor. It does, right? If a prosecutor can go to somebody and say, hey, you get convicted, 5 years in prison, 15 years in prison, right? That is very helpful in doing their job, right? A lot more people are willing to plead out when the threat is that extreme, right? As a conservative, I have a problem with putting that much power in the hands of individual executive branch officials, right? I mean, again, as much respect as I have for law enforcement, including prosecutors, these are government attorneys, and I could tell you stories about working on these issues in Washington, D.C., and having Department of Justice folks tell us, or U.S. Assistant U.S. attorneys tell us, well, you don't understand. I know you don't think that people should go to prison for 8 years because they imported lobster tails in the wrong kind of packaging, but you don't understand. We know these are bad people. We know these are, we can't prove, we can't convict them of the other things that we suspect that they did, but we're going to punish them for those things we can't convict them of because we've got these extreme penalties over here in what's called the Lacey Act, right? I think fundamentally we all should have a problem with that, but as a conservative, people who understand the separation of powers and limits on government powers, I think we should all have alarm bells go off when we hear that from our public servants. What does 781 do? Well, I mentioned, so 780 reclassifies some of these nonviolent offenses from being felonies to being misdemeanors. That means that instead of going into state prison, people go into county jails. That means that the state should save money, and the counties are going to have additional expenses. What 781 does is say, look, we're going to set a baseline at the state level in DOC, and as we realize savings, we are going to direct the savings, as the cost falls below that baseline, we're going to direct those savings to the counties on a per capita basis, right? And try to get the counties to use those programs for locally based drug treatment, mental health programs, right? The kind of things, and I've seen the polling, the kind of things that Oklahomans say, if somebody's addicted to drugs, if somebody has a mental health problem, we don't want them in prison. We don't even really want them in county jail most of the time. We want to be able to offer those people help. And there are great programs like Remerge, like Team. There are great programs around the state. We need more. We need a lot more of those in Oklahoma. And 781 is a sort of a down payment on shifting in criminal justice toward that kind of treatment, that kind of help for people who, again, in most of these cases are going to have an addiction or a mental health problem. So what's the history behind it? I'm going to close with what I think is the most fascinating part of all of this. And it's really compelling to me as I learned about all this, and that is the history of justice reform in our country. Did anybody here know one of the gripes the colonists had in Pennsylvania, this before the American Revolution, one of the gripes that the colonists had in Pennsylvania long before the Revolution was that the British law was unjust, and the British law put too much power in the hands of executive branch officials, that is to say, the king. Right? Under British, the original definition of a felony was a crime punishable by death. That's why people lose their civil rights when they're convicted of a felony. You lose your right to vote, lose your right to own a firearm. That made a lot of sense when we started watering down the definition of the punishments for felonies, because we said, well, those people, I mean, we used to cut them off from society via the neck. Right? And that's where all this started. Of course, a lot of things were felonies under British law in the 17th and 18th century. And the colonists in Pennsylvania started to say, look, this offends our sense of right and wrong. This offends our Christian morality. We don't believe that somebody who stole some turnips out of somebody's garden should be executed by hanging, and we don't like your defense of that, because the defense, what the British would say is, well, look, the king pardons. If it's really unjust, the king pardons those people. So don't worry, right? King George he'll take care of you, right? They actually in Pennsylvania they changed their criminal code, and were forced to change it back because their charter said that they had to adopt similar criminal laws to the British laws. So this was an ongoing dispute leading up to the American Revolution. Now, it's just a little part of it, right? Mostly focused in Pennsylvania. But what do you think they did once they won our independence? One of the first actually, as far as I can tell, really the first state-based policy reform movement was in Pennsylvania, and to a lesser degree in Virginia and other of the new states, reforming the criminal code. Reforming criminal laws. And in fact, some of the reforms that they adopted were exactly the kind of things that are in State Question 780. I'm going to read you a little paragraph here because I think it's Usually I summarize it, but this is a an unusually erudite group here. So I'm going to read this. This is a great book. This is by R.J. Pastrito. Glenn Beck, 5-6 years ago, featured Professor Pastrito on his show several times. He's an expert on Woodrow Wilson and the Progressives. But before that, he wrote his thesis on, which became this book, on the founders and their criminal justice reform efforts. This is a great little kind of political philosophy, public policy book. Here's how he ends a chapter talking about some of these reform efforts in Pennsylvania. He says, a 1789 statute addressed the issue of separating convicted felons from other inmates, people who'd been convicted of less serious crimes. It required anyone sentenced to a year or more to be removed to a special part of the jail, which was to be considered a separate facility. This facility was to be called the Common Prison of the City and County of Philadelphia. The prisons, so what they're saying is, look, people who committed less violent crimes, who are in the lockup for less time, should not be mixed in with people who are violent, dangerous offenders. That's not good for anybody, and frankly, it's unjust. He goes on, he concludes here saying, the prison society often had to obtain court orders to force the jailer to comply with the law. By this one fellow's account, the jailer was almost as criminal as most of the inmates. By addressing such problems, the 1794 law represented a long-sought victory by Philadelphia's reformers, and it goes on and talks about, again, exactly some of the exact same kind of reforms in 780. Sir, I think he's trying to wave him down. I think one of your salads is up here. Glad to help. Okay. Oh, Representative Bennett's salad. Okay. So I'll write up that 30 seconds as legislative relations. This is actually our heritage. The more recent history, and I will close with this and I'll leave it to your questions. The more recent history is that as the political parties in our country shifted, and as I mentioned Michael Dukakis before, right? He's just the most well-known example, right? I mean, he actually, in Massachusetts, they were letting people they knew were dangerous out on weekend furloughs, right? Which is what, I mean, today the left thinks, they can throw around Willie Horton like it's some kind of indictment of the people who made that advertisement. I actually know, I worked with some of the people who made that advertisement. They didn't know the race of Willie Horton until they had scripted up the advertisement and they went to get the information they needed for the TV ad, and it turned out he was black. They didn't care. They cared that he tortured somebody to death. Right? Which is what Michael Dukakis' public policies allowed, and what common sense would say would be the result of such policies. The way officials of that political party in states like Oklahoma maintained their power, hung on to their power, in states like Oklahoma, in states like Georgia, in states like Texas, one of the things they did, you had a former state attorney general here recently. One of the things that they did was say, well, we're not like Michael Dukakis because we're going to prove how hard on crime we are, and we're going to ratchet up the penalties, we're going to make more things felonies, we're going to give more power to the executive branch to prosecute people, right? And I don't think that we should lose the fact that a lot of what we're dealing with now is the creation of people who are desperate to hold on to their political power in Oklahoma, and we're proving their bona fides, at least, proving that they weren't Michael Dukakis or Nancy Pelosi, by creating some of these draconian penalties that we're just trying to, we're just trying to even things out, bring things into accord with what I think most Oklahomans think is what we ought to do with, again, people who have drug addictions, people who have mental health problems, people who have committed nonviolent offenses. I really believe that 780, 781 would help to make Oklahoma a safer place, also a more just place, and turn a corner in how we deal with criminal justice here. So with that, I am just thankful I could be here and glad to take any questions.
Trent, that's a lot of fun, from OCPA think tank to radio talk show host to wait staff all at once. That's pretty impressive. So I think we're going to have some questions for sure. Just to start things off with, are you allowed to take a side? It sounds like you're allowed to say, yes, I'm in favor of 780 and 781. So is that true?
That is, that is true.
Very good.
Although I do try to,
We like to take sides in this room.
On my radio show, I don't tell people how to vote. I just tell them what the truth is. They've got to figure it out from
I
there.
think you lifted that from me. Okay, so my first question is about 780. You talked about these unfair high penalties for something that may not be deserving of that. And the argument goes, well, we don't have to go the max on that penalty. We'll be forgiving, like King George. My question is, could those penalties, because they're there, is there any evidence, do you have any knowledge, experience, etc., that those penalties being in statute could somehow be used to threaten, intimidate, or abuse a suspect into doing something that's not in his best interest out of fear?
Well, I do know, and I really believe that by and large, the DAs in Oklahoma, and particularly the ones that I've come in contact with, who I've debated on this issue, and they're on the other side, I really do believe, talking with these folks, that they actually they don't want to put people in prison, right? They do want to get people help. So I don't, but I do know exactly what you say has been documented in other places for sure, and there is this question, right? It's why, well, I mean, frankly, it's why half the Bill of Rights is about the criminal law, right? Half the Bill of Rights is about making police and prosecutors' jobs harder. And I shudder to think what we would hear if those weren't in our Constitution and somebody brought those forward today. We'd hear a lot of people say, you're soft on crime. You know, I mean, I don't know if people told James Madison he was soft on crime or not, but right. So
and then the flip side of that is, yes, but I have a tool that I could abuse.
Yeah,
we want to take away.
And I mean, we do know, right, that there are cases where, because the penalties are so high, right, people just plead out, right? I mean, people will plead to things that they didn't do, and I'm not saying that that's happened in Oklahoma because I don't know examples of that, but other questions.
Okay, we're going to start with Charlie.
Trent, normally I have real strong reservations about this. Generally, when liberals are in control, they like to pump money into education, welfare, counseling type programs. They let roads go to pot, and they like to empty prisons so they'll have some of that money to do that. So generally speaking, I'm against this. However, many of the other advocates of this that I've heard have made claims that in other states where this has occurred, recidivism rates go down, crime rates go down, they close prisons, there's less cost involved. Now, it's not going to be a savings to taxpayers because it's going to just shift from one place to another. Can you address the reality of whether or not this has had a positive effect in other states?
Sure, absolutely. So Texas is the example that's most often used. I mean, Georgia, Hawaii, Utah have made similar reforms, and California passed something similar. Texas is the one that's looked at most often. I do think it's interesting because when it comes to property crimes, I mean, they push that threshold up really high, right? I mean, $2,500 is very, very high. It seems high to me. And they got started on this road because their legislature was told, you're going to need to build, I think it was 3 more prisons in the state of Texas. And people looked at that. It's like Chris Steele's story, right? I mean, Chris Steele got involved in criminal justice reform strictly because he was involved in writing state budgets, and he realized how expensive all this was. And and now he works with people getting out of prison, trying to help them get job training and things, because he's recognized that the personal issue is even more important than the financial one. But Texas did see, with their package of reforms, which not identical to this, but some of the similar things, they saw their recidivism rates go down, their crime rate continued to decline, and not only did they not have to build new prisons, but they closed some. So that's I mean, we have seen these things work really well in some other places, I mean, I think that's probably the best example there.
All right, next question.
I actually have 2 questions in order to get to my real question. Would you agree with me that drug usage is an expensive habit?
I suppose so.
Do you know that from
sounds
experience?
Like I don't know that from experience. Sounds like it probably is. I mean,
but have you done research? I mean,
well, yeah, right. I mean, it's a market like anything else, right?
Okay. And would you agree with me that most drug traffickers and drug dealers are also drug users?
Most maybe at the very end of the chain, but probably not one step up from that. But I don't know that. I know a lot of people get pulled into being drug, mules and things like that, potentially because they're users, but obviously a lot of people not. So yeah.
Well, I guess my overall question, my underlying question is, who are these people? Where do they get the money to fund this habit, which typically runs a minimum of $100 a day?
I don't know that it's. I mean, it is interesting when you read about the opioid epidemic and heroin, and you do see, right, people move from drug to drug depending. I mean, in some cases, depending on what they cost, especially where some of these drugs they're all opioids, right, and so people move from the more expensive ones that they get hooked on. In the case of some of the pharmaceuticals to heroin, because it's cheaper, and meth has had a lower street price, which I know was part of the meth epidemic. And I'm told that Oklahoma has some places that have big heroin problems, some places that have big meth problems. But yeah, I mean, I think some people get the money from being involved in the drug business in some way. Some people get the money because they have it and they actually have a job, depending on, some people are not fully incapacitated by using these drugs. Some people are on public assistance. Some people are committing other crimes, right? There are a lot of things I'm sure that people do.
My name is Paul. I have a question. Everybody says that crime rate decreases, recidivism decreases. Has any study been done since you're moving things from a felony to a misdemeanor? The felonies drop. Are the misdemeanors increasing, or are they staying the same, or what? Because a crime that would have normally been a felony, I'm sure, is still going to be committed, but now it's a misdemeanor.
Yeah, I mean, I do in the studies in Texas, right? I mean, they're tracking. They're not saying, well, we're having less felonies. They're tracking the crime rate overall, and they're tracking the incidence of some of these specific crimes and seeing these things go down. So that's a good question. But there they are. I mean, they are seeing these things. They have seen these things go down. So yeah.
Trent, I have this dollar that I can give to the church, and they can help to somebody out of this of addiction and do so in the name of Christ. Or you can vote to take this dollar from me through taxes and do it in the name of man through government. All right? Morally, do you really have the privilege of... I mean, is that actually the right thing to do, to vote for 781 to force me to give it to the government?
Well, 781 doesn't raise your taxes.
I'm not asking about raising taxes. It would be nice to lower it by $1. I give it to the church, and they can implement the same program.
I agree. I mean, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. But I'm not going to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Right. I mean, no. I mean, I agree. Right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Right. It'd be better to do these things privately rather than through government in the name of God, rather than in the name of. I agree with that absolutely. 781 doesn't. If it increased our taxes, I'd be against it.
Will you join me in voting no on 781?
It doesn't increase your taxes. It has your argument has nothing to do with 781.
No, we have two arguments going on here. We have a moral argument going on, and we have a dollars and cents argument going on. Let's quickly summarize both. Bob is saying that it is not the proper role of government to provide programs for people's rehabilitation. That is the job of families, churches, communities, private organizations, not government. So you need not look past the moral question to know you should vote no on 781. But now let's look at the dollars and cents for a moment. I want to give you two real-life examples, okay? In Mustang, we recently had a tax expire. It was going to go away. So we had a vote to keep it in place. No one called it a tax increase, but it was, because the tax was going to go away. We kept it in place, but they said, no, it's tax neutral, everything stays the same. Well, it's not. That's a lie. You're looking at it the wrong way. We had a chance to get our money back, and they continue to steal from us because we voted for that. So that's a problem. Let me give you another example. Another example. A guy goes down to the hardware store with his allowance, and he gets a power drill. He comes home with the power drill, and he says, look, honey, at this power drill that I bought for free. And she says, bought for free? He says, yeah, it was originally $40, but they had it marked half price, so with the $20 I saved, I got this drill for free. Okay? So we are going to see cost savings in theory, maybe in reality. How will you measure those cost savings? Well, this act actually says that the Office of Management and Enterprise Services can use their best guess to figure out what the savings are. And then we have this brand new slush fund that they can throw millions of dollars in, however much they want, so they can redistribute it, socialism, back out to all these government agencies to provide services that are the improper function of government when we could just keep the savings. So there's the dollars and cents and the moral, and now I'll get back around with more questions.
But let me speak to that though. There's no provision in 780 to, I mean, by that same argument, if someone put up an initiative that would cut our income tax in half, we would have to vote against it because it maintains half the income tax.
No.
Yes.
No.
Because
you're voting not to maintain it,
because
but to cut
all
it.
of this money, I mean, I agree on the moral question, but all this money stays in government anyway, which is a problem, right? But it's not, if you vote no on, here's what happens. If you vote
not
yes
if
on
the
780,
budgeters give us the savings back, which they should do, which is why we hold Bennett and other guys like that accountable in the legislature for a balanced budget instead of passing debt against the Constitution and God's law.
If you vote yes on 780 and no on 781, what happens is that money just stays at the state level, right, and doesn't get out to the counties,
and where would it stay?
Instead of being at the county level and local government, which is at least better.
Where would it stay?
Right.
Would it not stay in the law enforcement, courts and prisons area, which maybe could be argued is a proper role of government?
I don't. No, not the way not necessarily. I mean, it stays in the ultimate slush fund, right, which is the general fund. That's the ultimate slush fund.
This is a brand new slush fund, and you have a chance to say, no, we're not giving government more money.
It's a littler slush fund than the big slush fund. You vote no on the little slush fund, you're endorsing the big slush fund.
All right, more questions.
I've got two questions. Number one, is this a law or statute that is going to apply only to the drug users, or is it going to apply to all the misdemeanors?
It is, so it's property crimes. The threshold for what is considered a misdemeanor goes from 500 to 1,000. So it applies to a whole set of property crimes. And there, if you look through the actual initiative language, it's just they're all kinds of different sort of property crimes. And then it applies to simple possession of drugs. So those are the two general categories.
All right, my next question is, the way you're describing it, these are victimless crimes, the property crimes, because the victims are out that money or whatever from the person that has stolen from them. So they have to make it up somehow.
I'm not sure what your question is. I didn't.
Okay, if I came over to your house and stole your lawn tractor, would you be out anything? Would you be a victim of that crime?
Yes.
Okay.
He didn't argue these were victimless crimes.
But the way it's presenting.
No, the measure makes a difference between simple possession, which you could argue might be victimless, and other type of misdemeanors, right?
There's still it doesn't make anything not a crime, right? It doesn't. All those property crimes are still crimes. It doesn't make anything not a crime, right? I mean, there's misdemeanor assault, right? There are all kinds of misdemeanor crimes that are. And as I said, it used to be everything that wasn't punishable by death was a misdemeanor crime, right? So there's a lot of property crimes.
Okay, 2 points there. I love it when people compare what other states did. Let me tell you about Texas a few years ago. My best friend's dad spent 11 years in prison for stealing 11 cases of beer from a distributor. That was the laws in Texas years ago. Granted, they need to change. Okay?
Yeah.
Something. And I believe. But there's so many, back on 781, there's so many alarms right there. First of all, a new fund. Some group's going to say, well, okay, we estimated we got this much. And what counties we distribute it to is going to be up to them. That's not the whole
problem,
deal's there's alarms there.
Well, the problem is because look, when I was involved in drafting, so I can speak to what the thought process is, right? If you downgrade the punishment on these crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, it is a huge cost shift from the state to the counties. And the problem is the better it works, right? The more that cost shift happens, and look, I don't disagree with the moral argument. The problem is, I'm not going to write a policy that's going to bankrupt all our counties. Frankly, I think our counties are doing a lot better job than the state is in many cases, right? Right? There are some counties that don't have any ordinances, and they balance their books, and right. I think that's pretty good, right? So that's my problem. I didn't want to push a policy that was going to stick it to the counties when that's not the point, and I don't know. Maybe other people are more optimistic than me. I didn't think that the state was going to turn around and say, well, we're going to give this savings back to the people. I just,
Maybe they won't, but I think what we fear is millions of dollars now go back to the counties for something they weren't previously doing. And now you have to have administrators and new programs, supervisors.
It's not things that these aren't things that they're supposed to be doing right now, right? Their costs are just going to go up, right? This is things like drug courts and these programs, in some small counties, they might not exist.
But that's not what the measure says. It talks about rehabilitative programs. That's different than law enforcement.
Those programs do exist right now, though.
One of the things that you were talking about was felony convictions and the abuse of felony convictions about lawyers. One thing to consider in that is that lawyers often prosecute for misdemeanors as opposed to felonies because they're easier to convict. So sometimes they'll just stack misdemeanors in order to get what they want out of the punishment.
Yeah, no, that's stacking of charges and and including if they're misdemeanors that's a real problem. I agree with that. I think like I said, I think there are a lot of challenges in the criminal justice system nationwide and here in Oklahoma. That's definitely one of them.
I just wanted to make a statement too. I'm familiar with the system some, and I feel like the counselors that the government provides do not always help the person because they usually tell them their family is the problem and they do more dividing to the family. I would like to see some kind of amendment done to that where counselors, whenever they counsel people that have a mental illness and problems with drugs, that their families would be incorporated. That's what NAMI has been created to help put families into the program. And that would be very beneficial if the government would include family counseling. In other words, not isolate the person because that person is a part of a family unit. And if the government would acknowledge that more and put that into the counseling, that would be more beneficial. That's something I see.
I think that's right. And I think that the question earlier actually really speaks to that, right? If we provision more of these services ourselves rather than through government, I think we would naturally.
It's more of a family, and it's beneficial for it to be a unit that way.
Yeah.
When the government gets involved, they divide each other.
That's what, I really do. I do encourage people to look into TEAM. It's right here. That's the Education and Employment Ministry. It's right here in Oklahoma City, and it's pretty compelling, right? They're taking human beings who, I think the only way you get in there is if you acknowledge you did something you shouldn't have done, right? They're taking people who committed crimes, who did their time, who get out, and they are working as hard as they can to turn those people back into productive members of society. And I've been down there. I've met some of these people in the TEAM program, and I don't know. Okay. Okay.
All right, we're going to take two more questions, and then we'll continue peppering Trent after the closing prayer out in the church lobby.
You may have covered this already, and if you have, I apologize for missing it. But since we're going to make a lot of crimes now county responsibilities instead of state responsibilities, where does the county get the money for the incarceration?
And that's basically the point, right? So there is a little question of fungibility here, right? Because these 781 is not. It doesn't force them to spend money on any particular kind of treatment program, and I think it does include enforcement. I'm not, off the top of my head, I don't think that it specifies jail, but it should offset some of, it offsets costs for things that the counties do for the most part at least, do right now, and allows them to hopefully to cover those costs in the county jail. I do think that is a really important question. I want more local solutions. And one of the things I've become interested here in Oklahoma, and I know the cities are pushing this, some county folks are talking about this. I actually think, and I say this with some trepidation because I recognize this is potentially opening a can of worms. Just in general, not specifically here, but I do think that as conservatives who want more local solutions, we should pay attention to making sure that counties have good revenue sources, right? That they have stability. I would. Anyhow, which is just to say, I think that's an important question, and I think there seems like there's maybe going to be a larger conversation in Oklahoma about. I've never seen local governments funded the way they are here, and it seems like it does leave counties vulnerable. Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have our last question from our most august member.
Are you going to connect this to the Blaine Amendment? Or I can do that at the end.
No, actually, Trent, I have a customer in a community I won't mention, but they own a counseling service, and they get funds from the state. So any Christian values they do, that's on the own of an individual counseling person, But one day I asked one of their counselors just how much recidivism that they have to deal with. And the answer was basically, really what we do isn't much good until they finally they go to jail for it. And that's the wake-up call. And many of them decide at that point in time that's not a place they want to spend their life from, and then they change from that point on. So that's just for whatever that's worth. I know we hear all this stuff about, you get in jail and you learn to be a real criminal then, but people go to jail for character problems.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's just my point.
I think that's a good. I think that's a good point. That's why I think it's important. I've heard some people say, well, a lot of misdemeanors result in tickets. This doesn't require that. This allows people to go to jail for up to a year. One point that I think is maybe universally true is that jails tend to be less nice places than prisons, right? Prisons provide offenders with a certain stability. These are for people who are going to be there for more in the long term, and whereas jails, and obviously jails should be run in a way that's humane. That's something that our founders were trying to make sure happened. But jails tend to be much less nice places. There's a lot less stability. There's a lot more, more sleeping on the floor. I know this was true in Washington State. I have a lot of family members involved in law enforcement up there. And and this is something they point out. Yeah, only one. But really, doing a month in jail to some people is a lot more horrifying. Certainly doing a year in jail is a lot more horrifying than going and doing a year or two in prison, at least there. Yeah,
the idea is that God brings people low. They have to be humbled before they can repent and then be rebuilt. And so how do we humble them is the question. This has been a really good meeting. Let me tie this in quickly to the Blaine Amendment announced next week, and then we'll end with a round of applause for Trent. Stay right there. The Blaine Amendment is the part of the Oklahoma Constitution that says we're not going to have state property or money being used to support or be involved in any kind of religious affiliated institution or organization. Direct or indirect, right. So right now we have a lot of good Christian faith-based ministries that are providing services to the people of Oklahoma in kind of a public-private partnership with the state. If the Blaine Amendment continues to be interpreted as our current Supreme Court has done so to remove the Ten Commandments, all of that will end. It's very important that we chop it out of the Constitution. So please get these flyers. Download them from our website. I'll link to them again the next 3 weeks in a row so that you can spread them around. Get them from Charlie. Next week, we're going to talk about the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority. We will have an expert on that subject. And please thank Trent for being our guest today.